Joining me live now without a Matilda scarf from Albury is the Deputy Liberal leader, Sussan Ley. You haven't rushed to put your scarf on like Don Farrell, I noticed, Sussan Ley. Not as opportunistic, perhaps?
No, Andrew. But I watched, well, I almost couldn't watch. And this is the thing, that penalty shootout, 120 minutes of no score, and Courtney Vine at the last minute. I think we were all screaming on our couches. I woke up with a big smile on my face, the same big smile I went to sleep with. It's incredible. And just well done, the Matildas. And what it does for women, girls, activity in our schools. I know that as I visit the schools in my electorate, I'm here in Albury and I'll head across Western New South Wales next week. They'll all be talking about it, and that makes it particularly special.
Yeah, fingers crossed for Wednesday. Well, look, I wanted to ask you first about Peter Dutton, quoted in The Australian yesterday, saying his government, led by him, would go for constitutional recognition of Aboriginal people and for regional voices, but not a national voice. Is this something that a Dutton government would look to do in its first term, hold a referendum into just constitutional recognition on its own?
Well, one step at a time, Andrew. Obviously, we've got a referendum that we're facing most likely in the middle of October. But what Peter Dutton has made clear is that we have had in our party's policy platform for many, many years constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, and that means something to us, and that is something we'll fight for. And we also know that local and regional voices work best. We did a lot of work on this in the last term of government. You go to any Indigenous community and you want their voices to be heard, and they don't always agree, just as all communities differ across this country. So how we get the best possible outcomes in every corner of this country is to listen to those local and regional voices. So contrast that with the trickiness that we've seen from Anthony Albanese in this last fortnight of Parliament, avoiding questions, running away from questions, not confronting the issue. And I always say, if you're a person who supports the yes case, you would have to be so disappointed in the Prime Minister. He's not fighting for what he believes in. He's not giving the explanations. He's just being tricky about this, and I think that's letting all Australians down, most importantly Indigenous Australians.
Well, I recall the press conference you took part in April with Peter Dutton. It seemed to me you are a key member, a key driver in the shadow cabinet, in the party room, on saying yes to constitutional recognition and these regional voices. Is that fair? You didn't want to just say no.
Oh, it was important on that day, while there were so many negatives being promulgated in many arguments, that we absolutely reassure Australians about what we actually want to see advanced, what's positive, what's necessary in the cause of closing the gap for Indigenous Australians. And unsurprisingly, Andrew, because we have had that position of constitutional recognition in our party's platform since John Howard's days, it's important to remind Australians of that, because what Anthony Albanese is doing is painting every single member of the Liberal and National Party and every single Australian who quite reasonably is thinking that they cannot support this and that they will vote no, as being against that constitutional recognition, as being against closing the gap, as being against advancing positive outcomes for Indigenous Australians, and nothing could be further from the truth. And this is really, really important. When I travel, and I'm constantly on the move, as you know, people are asking for that detail. They're not getting it. And if this government can't provide it, how can it expect Australians to back in this massive change to our founding document, the Constitution?
I guess the Liberal Party had years and years to move a referendum on constitutional recognition alone and failed to do so. So isn't Anthony Albanese right that if this doesn't get up, and his argument is Aboriginal people want the voice as part of that, I'm listening to them, if this doesn't get up, it'll be off the table for a long time?
Well, what that just proves is that he's not in this for Indigenous Australians and closing the gap. He's in this for the political advantage that it brings him. So those sort of threats, I don't think Australians are going to buy them at all. I think they want decency, they want leadership, they want honesty, and they want details and explanation from their Prime Minister. And to simply sort of say, well, if you don't vote for this, it's never going to happen, that's not making your case properly.
It could be a bit of a confusing narrative, though. You say you're talking to punters about this. If I was at a barbecue and I said, Anthony Albanese wants constitutional recognition and a voice, the Liberals want constitutional recognition as well, but a regional voice. I mean, it's not the cleanest narrative in the world, is it? People say, well, it sounds like they actually want what Anthony Albanese wants.
That's because Labor hasn't actually explained their full narrative, which is this permanent change to the Constitution, putting the voice in the Constitution where we know there will be challenges down the track, and not explaining that he committed to the full Uluru Statement, which includes voice, treaty, truth. And he said that, I think, less than a year ago. He said that many times during the election campaign, and now he won't talk about it, and he won't explain what that means and what those next steps are. And
All
again,
right.
This comes back to the lack of detail,
All right,
and he's running away from the issue. And
what do you make of the New South Wales opposition leader, Mark Speakman, announcing in the last couple of days he's back in The Voice?
Mark Speakman's a good person and a great opposition leader in New South Wales, and I support him, but I don't agree with him on this issue. I think he's got this one wrong.
Well, let me ask about this stoush in the Senate during the week involving the 60-day dispensing change, cheaper medicines, the government calls it. Why have you sided with pharmacists here? We pointed out on last week on air that pharmacists have given more than $600,000 to the Liberal and National parties over the last term of government. Does this have something to do with your stance?
Andrew, we're always on the side of consumers, and the misinformation that Labor is putting out about this suggests that we're not interested in cheaper medicines or 60-day dispensing, and nothing could be further from the truth. But it isn't about the pharmacists versus the government or the consumers, because actually pharmacists and consumers work together in every pharmacy across Australia to support vulnerable patients and their access to medicines. I've stood not just in my rural pharmacies, which open in small towns where, by the way, there is no doctor, so if you didn't have your pharmacist, you would be absolutely lost when it comes to healthcare. And I've stood in big city pharmacies, and I've seen how the pharmacists interact, care for and look after vulnerable patients. Not just people like you and me who may come in once a month or once every 2 months for our script, but people who need ongoing wraparound care, in aged care, in disability, who just have that connection and that conversation. And you can't get your medicines from a pharmacy if that pharmacy is closed. And that is what we are absolutely facing with this measure. And I say to people, when it comes to your health, do you trust Anthony Albanese or do you trust your local pharmacist? I think most Australians would go for their local pharmacist quite high up the list.
So nothing to do with political donations?
Absolutely not. Look at the policy, look at the actual effect of that policy, and look at what it does to vulnerable Australians. I go to towns, and I'm not going to name the towns or the aged care centres, where aged care is flat out getting both a doctor and a pharmacy to dispense their medicines. Now, those pharmacies that do that often do that for very little money. And the dispensing fee picks up these costs that you don't see that actually allow them to provide that care, hours and hours of care for vulnerable Australians that they know need that care. I spoke to a pharmacist in my electorate who came out on the weekend and literally went round to someone's house to deliver the medicines, knocked on the door, knows their patients, knows their families, knows their history. And if that pharmacy has to close or wind back its services, it's actually the patients, the vulnerable patients in particular, who will suffer. So what we've said to the government is we're not against going ahead and doing this. And by the way, neither are pharmacists. But let's do it properly. Let's sit down and work out a way that means that pharmacies will not close.
All right, nearly out of time. Just a couple of quick things I want to ask you about. The proposed visit by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to China. Do you back in Simon Birmingham saying he should not go until Cheng Lei is free?
We wish the Prime Minister well, and the comments that Simon Birmingham made underscore the real seriousness of the detention of Cheng Lei. And I know that everyone, but maybe particularly women, mothers, those who just appreciate how awful it is to be separated from your children, would have heard those words from her detention. and it really was quite heartbreaking. And I absolutely call on the Chinese Communist Party to release Sussan Ley. Secret trials, secret reasons, awful 3 years of detention, Andrew. It is just dreadful.
Should he go or not if she's not released?
Look, I'm sure he'll take all of these things into account. You know, I don't want to be telling the Prime Minister whether or not he should travel. I hope he takes them into account. It underscores the seriousness of the issue. It really does need to be elevated, and it is really, really important that it is addressed.